Thanks for all being here. Bruce will launch into an introduction momentarily, but let's start with a moment of prayer together. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Father God, thank you for the great gift of this new day, the gift of life and light, the opportunity to come together, to look and think about the beauty that you have made. Thank you for this time that Bruce and I have to share our thoughts and images, and also those of our brothers, Mark Sargent and Bill Franson. Be with us now in our conversation together. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
I guess Mark Sargent isn't here.
He's not. In spirit.
Well, good morning, everybody. Glad you're all here. So it's fallen to me to do a little introduction of our project and say why we're doing this morning. And I've got a few slides to show, and then I'm going to turn it over to Z, and he'll talk a little bit about one aspect of our project. Then he'll pass it to me, I'll talk about another, and we'll do this little tag team, and then we're going to invite you in to the conversation. Sound good? Great. Well, just a word about our title, Return. This was given to us by, everybody here okay? Yeah. This was given to us by Mark Sargent, who literally used this collaborative idea that he dreamed up to have an excuse to come back to Cape Ann, because he's now back in California in Morro Bay, and like our friends the Gadies who are here this morning, makes pilgrimage back to God's country every so often. And then they go back out to, that questionable place on the West Coast where there's too much sunlight and too much warm weather. But there's another layer to this title, Return, and it has to do with a whole constellation of ideas that we've been batting back and forth over the last few months. And one of them is the idea that we're all of a certain age, all four of us are over 70. And when you get to a certain age, and I think the average age in this room is probably closing in on 60 or 70, when you get to a certain age, at least as an artist, I think this is probably true for all of us, you start operating as much out of memory as you do your immediate perceptions. And that memory conditions the way you see things, the way you think. So the idea of return is memory laden. But it also, there's another layer to this that Mark and Z and Bill and I have been talking about, and that is Cape Ann itself, this sense of place that we're really drawn to, has this geologic time, is the only way to describe it, this massive drafts of time. We're talking millions and millions of years of rock formations. A rock is a big deal on Cape Ann. It's a granite mound. It's a glacial moraine, actually, is what it is. It was carved up and created by the advance and the retreat of glaciers over millions of years. So there's that layer to it as well. And some of that will probably come out in our talk. But I thought I'd just introduce the people. Bill Franson is, I don't know if you can see, I'm kind of in your way over here. Bill Franson's a photographer. He taught for a number of years, about 20 years at New England School of Photography. And then we drafted him to teach with us at Gordon. He taught at Gordon for about 13 years and is actually going back to teach there again this year. And Bill couldn't make it today, unfortunately. He's too busy resting up in Maine. So he's having a real Sabbath. This guy, everyone here knows, he's called the Z Factor, Jim Zingarelli. And he's no stranger to stone. And stone is a big part of our project, as you'll find out. Mark Sargent was our provost. He was our boss for nearly 20 years at Gordon. He's a writer. As I said a few moments ago, he's currently back on the West Coast in Morro Bay and makes pilgrimage back to Cape Ann periodically. And this project is one of the attractions for him to come back. He's been back a couple times just to go on hikes with me in particular, but last time he came back, he was able to, all four of us were able to get together, and you'll see some shots from that. And then yours truly, and these stones with sayings on them will come clear. But I figured, we're talking about stone. I thought maybe we should start an album, and the title, I think, is very fitting for the four of us. So just a couple words about how we got started this project. So Z says to me, Bruce, let's get together and go have a beer at the Great Marsh Brewery in Essex. And we invited Bill to come. And we were sitting down, and Z says, let's do something together as artists, not just sit here talking. Let's do something. Let's collaborate. Well, Mark Sargent, he didn't know this, but Mark Sargent had said the same thing about 2 or 3 weeks earlier to me, saying, let's do something together. Let's make something together. And for artists who are often solo flights, this is a really great thing to have other people you can talk with, people you can bat ideas around with. But then I said, let's invite Mark to make sense of what we're doing. Because as artists, largely we operate out of a nonverbal place, intuitively. We're not always sure why we're doing what we're doing. We're just sort of reaching into places where language sort of stops, comes to the edge of that cliff, and suddenly there aren't words. And that's where music begins. That's where art begins. In many ways, strangely, that's where poetry begins. Is when you can no longer define, you can no longer pin things down. And so you're looking for ways of getting at reality that transcends words. So these are some of the themes to our project. The word local, I don't know if you can see these on the screen, but that word local was one of the first things we talked about when we were dreaming about what would we do together. Well, a sense of place, a sense of operating out of what's here, rather than thinking exotic or think, foreign lands, or think locally. Deal with what's in front of you. That was one theme. Another was this idea of return that I mentioned a few minutes ago, and then memory, which is very much a part of that. This idea of time, which is both narrative time, the story of our lives, which we want to interact with, but also this idea of geologic time. These massive drafts of time that are represented in the rock, and then kind of through everything in our conversation so far, we've been talking about stone and water. The two things that are obvious about Cape Ann. And Cape Ann is, it's the place that we find ourselves, and it's the thing that's drawn us together. We're dealing with a bunch of different locations on Cape Ann. One of them is it has to do with the statues. The man at the wheel, the St. Joan of Arc statue, the Fisherman's Wives Memorial statue. This was Mark's idea. He said, let's deal with these things. Let's look at them again, things that we think are familiar. And he's written about them. I'll be reading a little bit in a bit. After Z talks, I'll be talking a little bit from Mark's written work. We're also, we visited Halibut Point Reservation a bunch of times. We'll be going back, returning. There's a lot of history there. And Mark has written about that history of the Finnish immigrants who came to quarry that granite. Most of the curbstones in New York City were quarried on Cape Ann, those granite curbstones. So history, water and stone again. Dogtown and the Babson boulders. If you're not familiar with that, you will be after today. But we strongly suggest you get a chance if you're able to do a little light hiking to go out to Dogtown in Gloucester. You'll hear more about that from Z in just a minute. Bass Rocks is another location familiar to a lot of people that know Cape Ann. Ravenswood Park, which Mark loves. That's one of his favorite haunts when he comes back. Walker Creek, where I live, is a favorite haunt, but it's also got a bunch of trails and very specific kinds of geologic and wildlife. And I think we heard from Dorothy Boris recently about the Great Marsh. Well, the Great Marsh starts in the Walker Creek Basin area around in Essex and West Gloucester. Red Rocks Reservation is another location we visited and we'll go back to, and that Mark has written about. And then finally, the Thompson Reservation, the Thompson Road Trails, a place that I walked extensively during the COVID lockdown. That was the one thing I could do, is just get out and walk, and I walked about 4 or 5 miles a day. A lot of it was in the Thompson Reservation. So, Z.
Thanks, Bruce. Again, thank you all for being here. This is just a great privilege to be able to work with these colleagues in a very different kind of way. Bruce and I taught at Gordon for a quarter of a century together, and we've shown our work together, but we've never been involved in a collaboration of this nature together. And then to be able to team with Bill Franson and Mark Sargent in doing this, this is just a wonderful opportunity. And we call this Return, but for me, being from the highlands of Amesbury, usually if I think shoreline, or we think shoreline, Catherine and I, we're thinking of everything from Plum Island all the way up to the Maine coast. But again, geologically speaking, we know that there is no Massachusetts, New Hampshire, or Maine if we're thinking in terms of those millions of years that these things have come to be. And Bruce has already alluded to the glacial melt that contributed to the boulders in Dogtown. So these are, Bill set up a camera and took this photo of us in Dogtown. I'd heard about Dogtown from Bruce and Bill before, but I'd never been, so this was a completely new experience for me being there. A little bit of history just relative to Dogtown. This is a 1932 photograph of what it looked like, and for a long time, going back to the 17th century when it was established, because water existed on this property, and therefore there was a large settlement that had been established there. But as Gloucester continued to grow as a city, Dogtown continued to diminish. But you can also see, the boulders and the deforestation that had taken place, in this area, and you can see where the boulders were. They were wide open to move from rock to rock. Now to go into Dogtown, you need a map and GPS to find your way around. And this is one of Bill's beautiful photographs of one of the Babson boulders. So Roger Babson, who was an industrialist, a kind of self-made man, actually ran for president at one point, had a very strong and conservative moral sensibility, about him. And he expected the stock market crash to occur, so he did not lose money. And but he was also a philanthropist, and there were a lot of out-of-work stonecutters, Finnish 35 stonecutters that he hired to come and cut these particular inscriptions on 36 boulders in this particular area. So we've got this wonderful refuge to go and move from boulder to boulder. How many of you have actually been to Dogtown? All right, significant number, of you. So you'll know exactly what we're talking about. Here is Bill armed with his camera. So Bill, he doesn't go anywhere, as you would guess, without a camera and his tripod, and so he's moving there. And a number of these things, you can tell that this was a particular period of time that economically was very difficult. And so one of the inscriptions is "Keep out of debt" is on one of the stones, and then sometimes simply single word markings. And so that's Bill's photograph on the left, and my photograph on the right, because I'm drawn to the lichen, the texture, the nature of the stone, even the letters themselves. Periodically, they get repainted, and I'm not quite sure how I feel about that. I wonder if I would just prefer, thank you, Patty. Patty's just done. So it certainly helps them to stand out, but sculpturally speaking, just the shadows, that exist on the letters would suffice. But in terms of these glaciers, they go back to the Pleistocene era. So, and it's the great melt, what we refer to as the Ice Age, between 2.58 million of years ago to 11,700 years ago. And I love the saying, a recent geological age. So once again, there was no state demarcations in terms of these, that every area along the New England coast was affected. This is another image that the one on the right. So a recent trip to Italy, I had the opportunity to teach again in Orvieto during September, and one of the things I was taking note of is inscriptions, the way that letters have been carved in stone. It's become a cliche, it's written in stone, or more often than not we say, well, it's not written in stone, so therefore there's somewhat of a flexibility. But if you have the word truth, written in stone, there's kind of a hard mark that's set there. And then kind of comparing that and these kinds of inscriptions, when things are written in stone, there's a particular kind of permanence that takes place. Here's two gentlemen in search of truth, and Bruce is checking his phone to be sure that we were on track where we were. I don't have a particularly great sense of direction. Catherine, my wife, is the navigator in the family. So if I'm going on a hike anywhere, I'm always going with somebody that actually knows where they're going and what they're doing. So being able to do this for me meant being able to do this with these dear friends. One of the other things to take note of in these boulders, and one of the things I take note of in stone, is the way light plays upon them. Things in stone have their reality in the exposure to light and the way that light plays on them, light and shadow together. The other thing I look for is the interaction of nature and culture, or nature and nature, as in the slide on the right. In terms of nature and culture interaction, Bill took this photograph on the left, where there's this kind of iron bar with a little hook inside it. You can see that on the slide on the left. And so it's like, what was that? What purpose did that serve? Was there some kind of loop or rope, that operated between there? So there are these particular mysteries that are left behind, and calls for a certain degree of archaeological research that goes on in there. But then there's also the way, and we see this all the time, we see it in asphalt. We lay down the asphalt, the macadam, and what happens? As it starts breaking apart, grass, weeds, plants start to push up through that. So we see this way in which nature shapes nature, this plant life that can actually, over time, split a stone. And finally, this image of the way, again, this influence of nature and nature, in which the way that the trees, now that it's reforested to some degree in order to get to these boulders, and so now the way the shadows of the branches start to play on them. All of these are become question marks for each of us as artists. We're looking at these, we're making these observations, we're taking these photographs, we're doing drawings, and we're saying, to what degree will the idea of branches and stone and plant life, the interaction of nature and culture, to what degree will they play into the very thing that we shape? And the other thing that of course has influenced this project is what Mark has written. And I just want to read a brief quote from Mark's reflection on Dogtown. And he says, if tales of witches, renegades, and canines created Dogtown's 19th century mythos, the next century belonged largely to painters, photographers, and poets. He goes on to say, Dogtown's most famous painter, though, lingered here for only a matter of months. An early American modernist, Marsden Hartley, discovered Dogtown in 1931. 1931 is about the time that these boulders were being inscribed. He deemed the place forsaken and majestically lovely, as if nature had at last formed one spot where she can live for herself alone. He believed he had found a, quote, druidic terrain, a cross between Easter Island and Stonehenge. I just love that quote. Hartley recast the boulders, scrubby pines, and slightly cubist forms in Fauves colors. The bold, exaggerated outlines around his rocks suggest weight and permanence, yet the full array of boulders, grasslands, and trails appear fluid, as if a landscape is in motion. Hartley scatters and piles his stones so that they do look like glacial debris, but he still casts harmonies, and here I love this, cloud, stones, and shrubs, if you will, the mark of the same maker, all right, found in there. You'll hear more about that later. Cloud, stones, and shrubs share common shapes, lines, and rhythms. He spoke often of his art in musical terms. He called one painting a, quote, rock doxology. When the wind ripped across the boulders, he heard a fugue. Bruce.
So just one quick word before I talk about the statues of Cape Ann, another topic that Mark has written about wonderfully. I wanted to say, the thing about the advance and retreat of the glaciers, you may not know this, but the coastline, the beaches of Cape Ann, are 100 miles from the original coastline. In other words, it's way out there in the ocean. And this was only, in geologic time, a blip 20 or 30,000 years ago. The coastline was 100 miles out. And geologists know this from lots of research, but one of the things that first showed that up was that the trawlers, the fishing boats, were dragging up mastodon tusks 100 miles out. These big beasts were running along the beach, 20,000 years ago. It's mind-blowing to think about that amount of time. So Mark has written about the statues in Gloucester. Z was just quoting him in his discussion of Marsden Hartley, a modern painter. But strangely, during the same time period, a traditionalist artist by the name of Anna von Hyatt Huntington did this famous Joan of Arc statue in Gloucester. I'll just read what I wrote here. She had Gloucester roots, but ties to France. In 1910, when she first entered a plaster cast of the Joan of Arc into the Paris Salon, she found that the judges doubted that she worked without a man's help. When proven to be her own work, that cemented her career and brought her first major commission of an even larger Joan of Arc for New York City. This 1921 cast in Legion Square in Gloucester was dedicated to the local soldiers who fought in World War I. Other monumental casts of Huntington's Joan of Arc were placed in San Francisco, Quebec, and France. So these things are kind of situated all over the place. Mark has written beautifully about Joan of Arc and her possible significance for our own time. I won't go into that, but I just thought I'd show you a couple photographs I've taken. One is, this plaque here says, for their country, 1917 to 1918, is right there on the statue. Here's a reading from Mark's piece called The Young Woman in the Sea. Gloucester's quadricentennial was a time to commemorate the history of a New England town and all that is wonderfully provincial about its unique heritage and nautical spirit. But we also arrived conscious of the transatlantic sympathies during renewed bloodshed in Europe. Joan of Arc and the Man at the Wheel took us back a century to a post-war interlude of sorrow and hope, even as we could still hear echoes of that campaign of that great war that was supposed to end. So he's talking, in his essay, he talks about what we're going through right now with the invasion of Ukraine, now the trouble in the Middle East, and that Joan has a particular significance now, her courage, her spirit, the fact that she was full of hope and faith in Christ, and she was unafraid. Here's a really interesting photograph of Leonard Kask taking a photograph of his sculpture, The Man at the Wheel. The thing about public monuments is we tend to think they just sort of happened, but they were made by somebody. This guy, Leonard Krask, 1940, after it had been installed, taking a shot of his own sculpture. But this is, the man at the wheel today and his family, because another commissioned work, the Gloucester Fishermen's Wives Memorial, is also on the boulevard there in Gloucester, facing out to harbor, as though waiting for their husband's return. And here's a picture of the artist, Morgan Falls Pike, doing the finish work on the mother. She has 2 children, and is placed there on the boulevard. See?
So again, this was all new experiences for me. Never been to Bass Rocks. Catherine and I, we celebrated our anniversary, and so we took a trip up to Bass Rocks together. Again, when we talk geologically speaking, we're talking about a coastline, and Bruce has already talked about the erosion and the retreat of the coastline. But all of this taking place 500 million years ago, when Cape Anne's batholithic granite cooked. It was a new term for me, by the way. I know about granite, but not that. And it's like, how does this happen? There's several things. There's the erosion, simply the wearing away from the sea. There's also tectonic shifts, which we usually think of occurring horizontally, but there's also something called uplifting. So what's happening is that the landscape, the earth is alive, and so what happens is things are rising and things are lowering. I remember reading in one book that the Green Mountains in Vermont and the very peaks of the Green Mountains in Vermont were once the ocean floor of an earlier ocean that had actually pushed up through here. So the earth is doing this even as it's doing this. So I got to Bass Rocks and a mermaid appeared out of the water. We got to know each other. And but I say 2 sides of Atlantic Road because a photograph on the left is this kind of raw state, if you will, of Bass Rocks, and on the right, one of the grand hotels that exists. I mean, Atlantic Road is a lovely area, as all of you probably know. But we were venturing to the other side, and I was talking with Robert Hanlon, and he said, we're going to Bass Rocks, and he says, well, there's places you can park up along this, so there's some places where you can pull up alongside of the road, which is what we did, and then we ventured out onto the rocks together. Once again, the bedrock of Gloucester was laid down 500 million years ago. Cape Anne's batholithic granite cooled. The granite was exposed by, once again, erosion, tectonic shifts, uplifting that's going on. And you'll notice that the nature of the stone at Bass Rocks is very different from the boulders that we were just looking at, because those boulders, because of the glacial melt, had actually shifted as they were, if you will, sliding off and locating themselves in various areas. So that granite indeed did come from somewhere else. One of the things I did when I was there, as I did when we went to Halibut Point, and just kind of set up my gear, did a little bit of study, did a little bit of watercolor and drawing, just to kind of become familiar. One of the things that drawing does is it familiarizes yourself with a place in a very different and more personal way for me than a photograph. At least a photograph I would take, as opposed to one that Bill Franson would take. One of the things I think about, especially at Bass Rocks, is the way that it's described, the way that this earth shifting, the tectonic plates shifting and uplifting, the words that are broken, dissolved, worn away by the processes of weathering and erosion, scraped, shaped, and strewn over the last American ice age, for 10,000 years. Once again, a geologic moment is the way that it's described. 10,000 years. One of the things I'll also do is I have to play. I have to play when I'm there, and so what I do is just I kind of set things up. There's any number of artists. They're sometimes called earth art or land art, and I just saw a brief video early this morning on BBC about a land artist there. who creates a whole set of sculpture that is that will be worn away by the sea. It will be destroyed, and he does it in sand and in stone. One time we were visiting family down in the south of Italy, which is Puglia, down on the heel of the boot on the Adriatic shore, and I was taking stones and I created this mosaic out of these little stones of the face of Christ, kind of like a mosaic, in the way that I created the contours. And I left it there, and I came back the next day expecting that the stones would just be scattered everywhere. Other people had come to the beach. It's a rocky beach, and I came, and it was exactly intact. No one had touched. I figured it was just like, the face of Christ. We have to leave that there, kind of with the nimbus, around the hair. So my guess is that these rocks have long since shifted around in that way. And one of the other things, I asked Catherine to hold up this one stone, because you find that in stone there's all kinds of other stone that exists, and particularly mica, and the way that mica is like glitter. It's like natural glitter, the way that it catches the sunlight. And one of the other things to take note of is that there's this one large rocky mound that's out there, and there's cormorants that are out there on top of that rocky mass, and you see it in both photographs there. And so this was a grand day to celebrate a 44th anniversary. And just a quick little reading, from Mark's piece on Bass Rocks, and what he says, and it's called My Father at Bass Rocks, and it was one of the last photographs Mark took of his father that he always had in front of him. And and that photograph, he had taken his father at Bass Rocks as his father was beginning to experience dementia. And so there's a lot of reflection on Dad and on time and on the passage of time. Dad taught us to love the ocean because it reinvented itself with each wave. We dug forts in the sand for the sole purpose of waiting in them until the water came crashing in. On almost every stroll along the surf, Dad would collect pieces of sea's refuse, things that we all do, right? Driftwood became ornaments for the garden. Seashells lingered for months in our glove compartment. I always loved the sand dollars, the skeletons of sea urchins. They were rare enough on our beaches that we would always save what we found. My mother stored them with her china.
Another place we have visited several times and we'll go back to again and again and return to is Halibut Point Reservation. The very first time I went to Halibut Point was probably 1972, so a long time ago, and there were no guards, there was no parking lot, it hadn't even been declared a national park yet, and so the only way to get there was this very narrow path which was full of poison ivy, and you had to pick your way through. And the very first time I was there, my friend Steve Amazine was my guide. He didn't tell me what to expect. He said, we're just going to go on a hike, you'll enjoy this. He didn't tell me that there was this massive quarry at the end of that path. And then beyond that, the tailings of which were mounted up to create this man-made mountain, a little bit like Paul Cézanne's Mont Saint-Victoire. And then the slabs of rock going down to the sea, like folds over top of each other, just so majestic. It was just a shock when I first got there. So it's sort of etched in my memory, which is another theme that we're trying to work with here, is geologic time, but also 44 years of marriage. In my case, 50 years of marriage. And also this kind of periodic revisiting of places we think we know. And what we discover by doing that is there's a defamiliarization that happens by going back again and again, because it's never the same place. It changes. But some things barely change at all. Granite is one of them. And this granite quarry is just astonishing. Here's another little bit from excerpt from one of Mark's essays. Whenever I visit the quarry, I'm never sure whether I'm looking at an industrial scar or the mirror of nature's beauties. This was, for nearly a century, an exploitable fringe of American progress. But now, the wildlife and vegetation have reclaimed the terrain. Ferns and brush crawl over the edges. The quarries have become a rare exception, a saga about how a rural landscape was plundered for urban desires and yet discovered a resurgent beauty in the process. The legacy of ravage and renewal lends the point its spiritual essence. Amidst the still waters and relentless breakers, there is a heritage of newcomers in nature, both thriving against the odds. And here's a photo of a place that I found myself going back to a bunch of times, and like Z, pulling out my sketchbook and doing a little drawing, a little watercolor. One word about what we do there, the sketch process. You're not trying to make a work of art. There's no pressure to make something, some masterpiece. It's all just about making a response, about slowing down enough to actually look, and look again, and look again. Because the thing you think you know, when you observe it carefully, you discover it has layers that eventually move into mystery. This place in particular has that effect on me. So we're hoping that this coming together of these four people, a writer, a photographer, a stone cutter, sculptor, and a painter, combining sight and insight, that are 4 points of view, something might be birthed that offers an invitation to memory, to a greater sense of place and belonging. And that's you. I mean, we don't know what form this is going to take yet. I've started some paintings. Z has started some carvings, which we'll talk about a little bit next week. Mark has written a number of essays, which he's continuing to refine and add to. But for us, the idea of the collaboration hasn't yet come clear. We know we're in conversation. That's really all we know right now. We don't know if a book will come out of this, or an exhibition will come out of this, or we may scrap what we're doing. I mean, I routinely talked last night at Christ the Redeemer Church about my process as a painter. I routinely scrap things that I've started. I mean, and I put a lot of time into, and then gets wiped out. So we don't know. This may yield something worth keeping, and it may not. It's a conversation, like I said. And so what we're going to do right now is we're going to literally start a conversation, the two of us, and then invite you in. How's that sound? All right. So, Mr. Zingarelli, how did you end up wanting to carve stone? No, just kidding.
That's good. I've been carving in stone. Some of you have already heard this, in another presentation. But I've been carving in stone for 40 years now, and for me it never gets old. And yesterday, not yesterday, but Friday, Catherine came home from work. She's a nurse, with Leahy in Ipswich. She came home from work, and I was covered in dust in the studio, and I just said, I still feel at home here. It's like whenever I pick up, a hammer and chisel and any of the other tools that I use, it feels like this is what I'm supposed to be doing. How about you as a painter, Bruce? You've been painting for most of your life, so.
Yeah, I mean, it does feel like geologic time. I mean, I've been painting for more than half a century now. I like your idea that you feel at home with stone. I feel at home with paint, but I also feel at home on Cape Ann now. And I grew up, both my wife Meg and I grew up moving around a lot, and we've been on the same street for 37 years. So we are officially stationary objects. Only a glacier could move us. But no, I feel like that homecoming idea is very much what Mark is trying to get at in his written remarks. This sense of, we all have a sense of homelessness, I think, coming out into a culture that has been, barraged by information is the only way to describe it. And it kind of dislodges you. But this slowing down, I think, is a big part of what we're doing. I don't know. What do you think?
I think so, and I think that the idea of, it's like the idea of planting yourself somewhere, you know, calling someplace home, you know. I don't know how long you have to live in New England till you're allowed to call yourself a New Englander, you know. So, I mean, we've been in Amesbury for 28, almost 29 years. We were in Connecticut for 9 years. I don't know, some people don't call that New England. So it's certainly the place that we've planted ourselves. But again, I always wonder, kind of like looking at that through, you know, in the scope, you know, we use these, you know, 40 years, 50 years, but we're kind of comparing this on and against, you know, these billions of years in which all of this process, you know, within the natural world, within creation, and continues to go on. And that's why I'm just so much conscious of not only my own life, the life of my family, the life among friends, the life of our church, you know, conscious of that, but also trying to always be conscious of this place that we all live, and trying to be conscientious about this place where we all live, so that we're not just leaving scars on the earth.
Yeah, and yet there is that theme in Mark's writing about the beautiful scar of Howlett Point Quarry.
Yeah.
It is literally a scar, a gash in the earth, but it's filled up with water, and now it's beautiful. It's become something beautiful. I thought I would like to quote you one more time. I've quoted this thing that Z said years ago, probably 20 times now, but it just, I can't get enough of it. When he was first invited to teach at Gordon College, as a form of hazing, he had to speak in front of the president and his guests at an important VIP dinner. And he rose to the occasion, and one of the things you said that night has stuck with me forever, and that is, your ambition as a sculptor is to make something such that 2,500 years from now, someone will pick up a fragment of it and say, this was made by a human hand. And I feel like in some ways our project, that's the heart of our project, is the sense of place, but also the sense that we want to make a mark, but we don't have the ambition to make a name for ourselves. That's not what this is about. This is not about burnishing our reputations. This is about making something that's faithful in response to an amazing place. And maybe 2,500 years from now, I don't think they'll find my paintings kicking around, but they might find a hunk of something you've carved in stone.
I wonder if one of the things that collaboration does is, I think it takes the pressure off, you know, it takes the pressure off, you know, the idea of my work, you know, or my name, or, you know, any notion of recognition or fame, you know, it removes the pressure, and it brings it back into this place, you know, of conversation. Yeah. And that's one of the things that I'm already enjoying about this. Even though I'm off in my studio, you're in your studio, and Bill's printing photographs, Mark's, you know, we're in these different places, but there's this wonderful connected tissue that's occurring with this project already that really energizes me. And yeah.
Yeah, we've got some time here, 15 minutes or so maybe some responses from people out there. You're going to have to listen because I can't hear.
Okay, you got it.
I think you've got your book right there. These are made by human hands, and you're obviously collaborating really well. And so you've got it right. You just discussed it. You just have to do it.
Thanks. Repeat it for the people online.
Yeah, sure. Is the belief that perhaps we have already a thematic direction, that and being that all of these things are made with human hands. So thank you. And I think that it's one of the things about, you know, it's like our most technologically savvy member, Bill Franson, yet he continues to work with negatives. He continues to work with black and white photography. His love for that, and his love for that process, and the lengthy process, and the kind of I mean, you're seeing, just some of the digital images, over here of these photographs, but they're absolutely beautiful, and they show the hand in the eye of an artist as well. Yeah.
Well, it's a really interesting interaction that you've already explained between nature and the human element, and how we use nature to put everything together.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's the connection of humanity and the natural world, and trying to create a cooperation, as opposed to any kind of abuse, if you will, of the natural world. Yeah. Thank you. Paul.
Okay, question for both of you, but it actually comes from Bruce, something that you said earlier about memory becoming at one age is more and more of an issue, an influence, a resource. I was just curious as to how that might connect with what you all were saying about home.
Could you repeat that?
Yeah, how does memory, contribute to the work that you're making in regards to the concept of home that we also discussed?
That's a beautiful question, Paul. Paul and I were talking, if you don't mind me saying, a little earlier before everyone got here, about the fact that at our age, memory is starting to break down a little bit. And so, in some ways, making artifacts, a quilt, a painting, whatever, is a way of cementing memory, of giving yourself a sense of place, a kind of map of memory. But I think the way it relates for me to home is, and I'll just say it because I really believe that my ultimate home is with God. I feel like the homing signal that I have is this invitation that the Lord has given us to enter into communion, to be with the Lord, but also with one another. And I feel like this collaboration is really more about our friendship than anything, because we're all really good friends, which is, it's a blast to do something just with friends, and that's where my home is, in the conversation, in the relationship. Yeah.
Yeah. Meg.
So I just wanted to comment that you're not just collaborating with each other, you're collaborating with God through geologic time and creation.
Ah.
So you have a fifth partner.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's true.
And my other just comment was, have you taken these guys to Cape Hedge Beach to see?
We haven't gone there yet, but that's
You
another
gotta
good
take that.
location.
Yes.
See what?
Yeah.
It's Cape Hedge Beach in Rockport. It's all these rounded, smooth rocks and a huge, giant dune along the whole.
Dunes of polished stones.
Dunes of polished
Cape
stone.
Hedge Beach.
Cape Hedge Beach. We used to call it Pebble Beach, but it's not. Pebble Beach is at the other end.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's
It's
another one of the
Rockport.
mysteries of Cape Ann, this formation, literally dunes of polished stones, of granite, all different colors, all different shapes, mostly kind of egg-shaped or rounded. But I still haven't I actually asked a geologist, why are they all there? Why is that one place on Cape Ann where all these beautifully polished stones, I mean, literally mounds of these things, and he said he didn't know. He said his best guess was something to do with the currents. Denise.
When you go, make sure you listen as the tide goes out, because it sounds like bones cracking against each other. It is both gentle and jarring at the same time. There's a really unusual music to it. I don't feel like I've ever heard anything like it anywhere else.
That's beautiful.
Denise, I'm so glad that you brought this up, but the whole idea of sound and music and water playing into it. I'll read a poem next week by Octavio Paz, which is called Wind, Water, Stone, which kind of for me is a wonderful kind of summary statement of hopefully a direction that I find myself or ourselves moving in. And so the whole idea of musicality and water with the stone, I mean, all of those things. I didn't mention enough about the role of water in this. I mean, I talked about it in terms of erosion, but there really is this rhythm and syncopation that's occurring in in what it is that we're hearing, even as we're observing. Thank you.
Robert?
So there's actually a pile of those popples that were recently removed from Long Beach. And a landscaper has that pile in West Gloucester. I don't know how big it is, I just heard about it yesterday. But they might be available if people are interested in it. I first met those rocks when I think I was in high school, and it was at night, and if you sit on the top of the pile and you throw them down, they make sparks when they hit each other, along with the music. So it's quite a show.
Wow.
Could you repeat that for the people online?
Yeah, it's the idea that a landscaper, you said, that has evidently removed a whole,
The town removed them, and he ended up with them.
And
They
he
just want to dump them somewhere.
ended up with them, so.
That's how people see rocks.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to say about rocks was having moved to Cape Ann exactly 50 years ago this month, and on Concord Street, where we still live, and several ways that memories have been embedded in rock are, of course, gravestones, and right across the street
Yes.
is Thompson Street, and the graveyard there has not just stones that have the memories, the names, but they're being eaten up by trees.
Yeah.
There's one, a tree fell over, and there was a gravestone under the enormous oak tree that got exposed by it. So there's this cemetery, and of course, downtown, when you look at the fisherman's statue, I never look at the statue, I look at the names that are carved.
Yes,
I
yes.
thought they were in stone, but I think they're on brass plaques and not in stone.
Yeah, those inscriptions, within stone cemetery monuments, gets me thinking of, and there's one of the walks that I take up in Amesbury goes past old graveyard that goes back to colonial times, in which all of them were carved in slate, and slate is a marvelous outdoor stone. And any of you have flagstone paths that are made from slate or Pennsylvania bluestone, and there's an incredible longevity that they have, and so you can still see the names and also particular kinds of images. Oftentimes skulls and wings, are part of the gravestone. Interesting too that stones that were carved in the post-Civil War, so a lot of fallen soldiers, both Union and Confederate, a lot of the stones were in marble because they were beautiful and white. But marble is not a great outdoor stone, and many of those grave markings have actually kind of melted, and of course acid rain from traffic has also contributed to that. But the slate has held up so much better over time. Yeah. Denise, you had your hand up.
Oh, I just wanted to say that taking my children to Cape Hatch Beach, like they would walk out of the car and grab the first rock that they would find, and then say, "Mama, look." Like this was their personal candy. And we had to limit at some point. You have to bring back 3 rocks, and you can only take 3 rocks.
Yeah.
But each one was personal to them, so that's sort of like, oh, this is going to be a long walk.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
It's beautiful.
it was the same, and probably a lot of us have had this experience with our children. Our daughters would, I would oftentimes have a pocket full of stones, after we had traveled someplace, we came back with.
Robert, did you call those rounded stones popples?
Popples, yes.
Yes.
That's good to know. I didn't know that.
I did not.
Yeah, I mean, I heard the term several times, but when my friend told me yesterday, he's a Lanesville stone guy, and he used the term, so I figured I could use it.
Gail.
Yeah, just to explain what Robert was saying about the popples that were taken off of Pebble Beach, is because every winter when we get storms, all the popples come up over the road. It's just a little dirt road that they're not fixing up anymore for conservation reasons, but they plow it. They plow the popples. And so this year they didn't plow for almost 2 months, and so I think it was probably sometime in April or so. There was just huge mounds of popples that they took, and obviously I didn't know where they went. Usually they would just push them
Yeah, the popples had been relocated for
Because
conservation reasons.
Well, they don't plow that road, they keep the road closed
Ah, okay.
on Pebble Beach. And so when they plow them, usually they just keep them on the side, but for whatever reason, there were so many of them this year that they apparently took them to.
Yeah.
and this is your neighborhood, right, Gail?
Yeah, we live right there.
You're right there.
Overpopulated popples. I guess that's happened. I think so.
Maybe one last comment or question? Yeah, Dean.
I have a book in my library written by a geologist called The Stones Speak. And he was a professor in New York State University. But he drifted over to New England because he was fascinated by the stone walls. And he did a study over maybe 10, 12 years of stone walls. Hence the title of the book, The Stones Speak. So it's got something to do with location, but it also has to do with how those stone walls were formed and who was doing it.
Clearing fields and
Yeah,
all that. Yeah.
and that triggered a memory for me. We vacationed up in Maine, in the South Bristol area, and there's a fellow who has a farm. Interestingly enough, his last name is the same as mine. And we drilled together as Navy officers in Newport. He's an architect, and he wants to take care of his farm. So he was working on this wall, this stone wall that Joshua Chamberlain built of the Civil War era. And he regaled me and also very poignantly told me how the stones spoke to him. I just found that to be fascinating. This quote, inanimate object has something to say.
Yes.
Well, one of the things that we're really grateful to have Mark Sargent be part of this collaboration is he's a natural historian. I mean, he automatically launches into historical research when he starts to write because he's fascinated by the past. So if this does become a book, you can count on some really interesting stuff from Mark. He's written about 6 or 7 essays so far about these various locations, and he does a lot of historical research, and the stones are speaking, the quarry is speaking, the beaches are speaking, the graveyards are speaking through him in a wonderful way. You know what, if we do this much longer, we're going to have to call you all our collaborators. So maybe next week, come prepared to help us, you know. Thank you for your attention.